Um, so it's about storytelling, persuasion, and advocacy as much as having a thesis. We call it a theory of the case, and then proving that theory of the case by using case law, facts, so it's scientific, it's art and science in the same. So proving it throughout your brief. Students use different persuasive techniques, some that are sort of like within the structure of what all legal briefs must contain. But then they have a lot of leeway to kind of go beyond and write in a variety of different ways in order to reach the audience they're trying to reach in that particular moment. So there's a lot of different persuasive techniques students can use to make their piece effective. I wanted to use this session to describe two different but very related writing exercises that I've done in order to help students sort of like understand the value of persuasive writing, to see different examples and how they can incorporate it both from popular writing and from actual briefs, so they can see it should end up being something like this, but you can only learn to kind of grow by reading in other disciplines. So the value of persuasive writing, the various forms that it can take, and then guide them through specific writing exercises to get them started. I think doing this in class is really valuable for a couple of reasons. Sitting down, I have, you have all experienced this. You give an assignment in September and then it's like November 1st and they're just getting around to thinking about their idea. And then they're like cramming for 2 days writing something and it's not great because they've just written it in like 24 hours. So getting them to sit down early with a blank piece of paper and to start writing, that is the hardest part of writing, I find. So using class time to at least helping them to get an ugly draft down on paper, having them share it with students so it gets a little bit of legitimacy, like some approval from their peers, that helps them to get over that first hurdle of just even doing anything. So they can go home, they've got a draft saved that they can work from. It helps minimize procrastination. And then finally, writing is a very isolating exercise, or it generally can be. So using these exercises to bring their friends and classmates and peers into the process, I think is really valuable. Okay, so let's see. Got it. Okay, so I wanted to I'll just talk you through, I'm giving you 3 slides. 1 is like what I do before class, and 2 is the structure of the 2 different exercises that I run. And I can share them or you can take notes. They're very like simple. But here are some like potential class schedules that you could use. Okay, so in advance of whatever class I'm doing the writing exercise in, I assign 2 different pieces that have different styles and tones. And the students should have already read these before class. So I'll give you examples of what I do for both an introduction exercise, and I should have brought like a picture of what a legal brief looks like, but there's an introduction, there's a facts section, and then there's the analytical argument section. Each of these sections should do different tasks, just like you would have in any more technical piece of writing. They effectively do the same things, but maybe in a different order. So I would say pick whichever section you most want your students to work on. Probably the argument section is the last one that you should do, and you should use these to develop the more like persuasive, like communicating with an audience section. So the introduction piece, maybe. Okay, so for whichever, I'll give you the introduction to the facts, this applies to both. So pick some materials that they can read in advance. For the introduction section, I use briefs that were submitted in advance of Michael Cohen being sentenced. So you have the Robert Mueller, he was the special counsel. You have his brief, which is written in a very kind of straightforward tone and style. It's very like sparse. There's not a lot of like flavor to it, but it really gets the job done. It's very direct and everyone walks away knowing exactly what his argument is. It's full of facts. The other piece is, it was submitted on, they were filed on the same day. The other piece was submitted by the Southern District of New York attorney, who also submitted briefs in the sentencing hearing. That piece is much longer, it's more developed, it's more like there's more flower and flavor to it. So they're both arguing the same thing, but in very different ways. So I give students those two briefs to read in advance of class. And then I have them read some introductions from other briefs just to kind of see what those look like. So for whatever your discipline, I would maybe suggest two things that are quite similar in terms of their purpose, but coming from different angles. So the students will have read them before. And then be sure to cover any kind of like techniques that you want them to have already to be familiar with. So any kind of persuasive writing techniques for journalism, like you have to cover the who, what, where, why, when in the first paragraph, if I remember anything from my high school journalism class. So any kind of techniques that they need to know for writing this particular section or this particular piece. Okay, so for the introduction, like I said, I assign these two briefs in the Michael Cohen sentencing. I start class by going over or like recapping the persuasive, I focus on persuasive writing techniques. So things like tone, things that express the attitude of the writer, imagery, metaphor, punctuation, grammar, sentence length, structure, flow, transitions, all of those kinds of things. There are a couple Supreme Court briefs that I use also, one from Justice Kagan, one from Justice Gorsuch, who also sort of take very different positions and they have very different writing styles. Supreme Court briefs are actually great for this kind of thing because, and maybe they could be adapted for other disciplines, but they have to make their case in a particular way, and depending on the outcome that they're trying to support, they take very different writing styles. And of course, they're coming from different positions, as more liberal or more conservative. So you really get an interesting set of opinions that you can draw from. So effective use of case law, how do they signal, there are certain persuasive signals like see this or like compare with that. So all of these kinds of things you want to have reviewed in advance. So I just review that briefly. I also ask them to check for stereotypes and unconscious bias as part of this. So like, for instance, does your grammatical structure, and this is something we talk about in the bigger class about persuasive writing, but does your grammatical structure perpetuate a particular stereotype? Do you compare boys with, or girls with boys? Or do you structure your sentences in such a way that girls and boys are on equal footing, for instance? If you are using a stereotype, maybe that's okay, but is it intentional or were you doing it not even thinking about it? So just asking them to reflect a little bit on why they're writing the way that they are. Many of them might not have ever had to be critical about why they structure their sentences in the way they do. And so I'd like to use this as an example or like as an opportunity to ask students to just like take a minute to incorporate an exercise in thinking about unconscious bias into their writing. So a review, maybe 10 minutes on the kinds of writing techniques they should be using that day. And then the writing exercise that I started then. So it is the drafting exercise. So without any prompting, I think it's really important not to prepare them for what you're doing. Just ask them at that point, like take out a piece of paper or open a new screen on your laptop. And then without prompting or any kind of explanation, ask them to write a 2 or 3 sentence elevator pitch in their own words about whatever the motion is that they're trying to write. So what is the overall purpose of your motion? This is a motion to dismiss. So I'm trying to dismiss the case on behalf of my client. So this is a motion about, or this is a motion to dismiss the case, very basic elevator pitch. If somebody walked in and they had no idea what was going on, you could tell them in 2 or 3 sentences what the case was about. So I give them about 5 minutes to come up with an elevator pitch and to write it down. And this is all done on their own. Then I ask for volunteers to read their pitches aloud, and I'll ask for one, and then maybe I'll ask for a few more just to get a variety. And you might get some that are like very well developed. This person really knows what's going on, and others that are just very kind of crude and raw. So I try to take like 5 or 6 different examples of elevator pitches so other students can then hear what their peers are doing. Then I ask students to think specifically about tone, structure, metaphor, imagery, on all of those kinds of things, effective use of case law. Then I ask them to rewrite the mini paragraph that they just wrote. So build on the elevator pitch and then write a little bit more with these things in mind. So take your elevator pitch, see if you can restructure it, build with consciously thinking about tone and structure. So I give them another 5 minutes to do this, and 2 or 3 sentences turns into 4 or 5 at this point. Then I describe how in a beginner journalism class, you're usually taught about the who, what, where, why, when, and potentially how, and then you should be putting that in the first paragraph in order to catch your reader's attention. If they read nothing more than the first paragraph, at least they'll have the basics of what this article is about. So in order to get your new reader's attention, kind of think about the news story appeal that you want to capture your readers with. So then again, they rewrite the same thing, thinking about the who, what, where, why, when. So they're always adding in a few more details with a specific intention for each writing iteration. Okay, so they rewrite the elevator pitch based on those journalism rules, and I give them another 5 minutes or so to do this. Then I ask for 2 or 3, because now they're a little bit longer, I ask for 2 or 3 volunteers to now read these aloud. Then our introductions end with the legal outcome of your request for what you want the court to do. So then at the very end, I ask them to write what you want the court to do. So write your request. This is the first time that many of them are doing this. So for them, it is like the structure is sort of foreign. So giving them the specific rules of these are the things that need to be included. And then now you've got like a very rough draft of what your introduction should look like, and you can take it home and revise it. So they write their introduction, or they write their conclusions. The court should deny the motion to dismiss, and etc. I give them another minute or 2 to read those, and then I take 2 or 3 more volunteers, again, people who haven't spoken. So this gives you a way to get through most of the room to read their entire introductions aloud. And then I tell them, they don't know necessarily what they're doing. And then I say, like, congratulations, now you've just written your introduction. So they feel a big sense of accomplishment after this exercise. It takes, depending on how long you give them and how long people take, it can take anywhere from like a half an hour to 40 or 45 minutes. And then I tell them, be sure to go home and revise. And as your other writing goes, come back to this. So they've got their full introduction. Then we do a style comparison and compare what they've written to the the Robert Mueller brief and the SDNY brief. So I say, okay, you've read this before class. Let's now visit the Robert Mueller brief and talk about like the style, the style, the tone, imagery. What does Robert Mueller do in his introduction? What do you find compelling about it or not? Does your introduction look like his or not? And then I ask them to rewrite their introduction in the style of Robert Mueller. They do that and then sort of like compare with a partner. And then I ask them to rewrite again in the style of the SDNY brief, which is more, there's more to it, there's more information, there's more like flower and imagery in that brief. And then this is primarily to get them thinking about writing on a macro and a micro level. So what tools are effective at the sentence and paragraph level in each of these 2 different examples? Which piece did you prefer to read? Did you find Robert Mueller's very engaging for its like kind of sharp, to the point style, or would you prefer something that's a little bit more slow and engaging? Which one was easier to understand? Again, legal writing is mostly about communication. So you could write something very beautiful and flowery, and it's a gorgeous piece of literature, but it's really not effective as a piece of advocacy. So I remind them of, who are you writing for? What is your purpose? This could be beautiful, but if you have no idea what the purpose of it is or what that author wants you to do if you were the judge, it's not effective. And then again, think about your audience. Who's your audience as a litigator, and then who is the court's audience? The court is making decisions, maybe not just for the parties in front of them, particularly something like as kind of like in the news as the Michael Cohen sentencing. So think about, you're writing for the judge, but you're also writing for who the judge is thinking about. So should you also be thinking about what the masses, what the American public is going to be reading or in the news when they see what the judge decides? How could we think about that? So we sort of brainstorm a little bit on audience. So after they draft in each style, again, I have one volunteer read the different pieces aloud in each style. And then again, I have them write a minimalist conclusion for the Robert Mueller piece, or a more robust conclusion for the SDNY piece when they're drafting in each style. So that's the facts, that's the introduction exercise. Again, I think it's important to not tell them what you're doing in advance so that they don't think too much about writing something big. I just want them to focus on each discrete thing that I'm asking them to do for 5 minutes. And then at the very end, they can understand like, oh, this was my introduction. And then it's basically done. I think I did get somebody who turned in something that was, they did nothing more on the introduction because I remember them reading the full thing aloud, and then it showed up in the final assignment. I was like, it was pretty good the first time. But ideally they would work on it a little bit more. Okay, so that's the introduction one. I'll just describe the facts one as well. I have a few more details in this one. It's very similar in terms of structure, but slightly different. For the facts one, I start off with an icebreaker in which I ask students to get together in pairs and think about their favorite writing or their favorite story and what makes that a favorite story for them. And then we kind of regroup and talk about different stories that we like and what's compelling about them. What is it about the structure, the style of those stories that grabs us or that has made us think about them? Then I always use this New Yorker article about a French burglar. It's a really fantastic article, and I'd be happy to share it with anyone. It's really long, but it describes this guy who has a really interesting background. He's kind of on the streets. He's an immigrant from Morocco, and he's living in Paris, and he just loves art, but he's a thief. So he breaks into these homes and he'll steal various things. And there's this one home that he breaks into at one point, and he sees this particular piece of art on the wall. I think it's a Modigliani, and he just is enamored by it. And he sits down and he just stares at it, and then he leaves. He doesn't take anything, and he keeps coming back to the same house. He keeps breaking in multiple times just to sit there and stare at the painting. And then eventually one day he takes it, and he takes it back to his house, and he just wants to look at it. He doesn't want to sell it. He just wants to be in the presence of this painting. So the story describes this whole thing of the thief becoming enamored with the art. He's eventually apprehended by the police, and by the time you get to the end of the story, and the interview with the police becomes part of the trial, and he describes why did you break in, what was it about, so he has the opportunity to really tell his story of what compels him to do what he does. And by the end of it, you're like, do we like this guy? Do we hate this guy? He's a thief, but we're really inspired by him because he has this love and this passion for art. So it's very descriptive. It uses a lot of imagery. So it's a beautiful piece for describing facts in particular, but also other things. So we talk about that story and then, ask what it's about and what sticks out to them. Then we move into the review of writing techniques that relate to facts in particular. These are slightly different than what you would do in an introduction. Some persuasive writing techniques, but also other things about framing, organization, structure. What do you want to front load? What do you want to hide? I don't know if this is something you could do in other areas, but bad facts, you have to tell them, but maybe you tell them in a way in which you sort of couch them in the middle end of the story, and you start the story at the end and move backwards. So we talk about all the different ways in which you can write a statement of facts. I tell them what you must do and then give them a lot of examples of what you can do and still have a legitimate statement of facts. We talk about framing them, organizing them, and then we look at specific examples from that Art Heist article, the New Yorker one, and we look at specific examples of how that author wrote the facts. So we review it again, just now thinking about what could we draw from here as examples for statements of facts? Is it chronological? Is it non-chronological? Again, does it make you sympathetic to him? Does it make you admire him? What word choice has the author used to help facilitate that image of one perspective or another? Then I move on to 2 legal examples as a group. So we sort of do this as a group, and then we move to legal examples of legal statements of facts to look at. Okay, you can't write a New Yorker article for your legal brief, but you can use some of those style techniques that you saw there and drop them into legal briefs. So we look at now specific things of what they should be doing. Again, I use fact sections from 2 opposing legal briefs. So you've got the perspective of the plaintiff and the perspective of the defendant on the same story. And oftentimes you would never know. I mean, sometimes you have no idea that it's the same story because the issues they're focusing on are very different. So it really gets the students thinking about, I have a lot of freedom to write this thing in a way that is effective for me and still, pass the credibility bar. So we talk about the legal examples. I also think about things like headings. How can headings be effective to kind of draw in the reader, highlight certain things or downplay other things? Then I ask them to go in small groups and say, now that we've seen a lot of different examples, I ask them to write a letter to somebody who's not in the class, and I give them about 10 minutes and say, you're writing a letter to a friend that you feel very comfortable with, and you're just describing what this case is about. Not an elevator pitch, but something more, like describe the story, write, a half a page or something like that. Also, be interesting, right? You can't bore your friend or they will ignore your letter. This is not just a physical scene of what's happening, but it's what's the environment surrounding it, what's the political story, is there any kind of political thing happening in the background? Is there some kind of regulatory thing? Is it a medical thing? Just what is just beyond the core facts, what is the story here? And they all sort of come out with something a little bit different. Some are very kind of chronological and straightforward, and some really are thinking more spatially about the facts. So then I ask them to pair up with somebody and read their letter to the partner. And then I ask the reader, or I ask the listener, as you're listening, do you think that the reader was setting this up in an advantageous way? They all know the facts, they all know the underlying thing that they're working on, the whole class. So they have some familiarity with what the facts should be or are. So they can sort of point out I think you missed this whole thing, or I didn't think that's what this case was about at all. So they can have a conversation between the 2 of them. The reader or the listener can also say I didn't hear you describing these bad facts that you have to include. And so they can talk about why they didn't do that. And then, did you include facts that don't necessarily make their way into your argument, but that support your theory of the case? So we have this back and forth in which they read their letters to each other and kind of discuss what's compelling about them or what works or what doesn't. Then I asked them to, again, think about structure, the structure they used, and mix it up and try different styles. So I think about asked them to think about the 2 legal examples they saw, the motion for and the motion against, and say, you know, like the motion for, let's say they wrote a comparison story. And we talk about like, sometimes we watch movie clips where you see like movie screeners, movie trailers, where I don't know, for like the Karate Kid or something like that. You might have one story that's like from, oh my gosh, I forget his name. Danny's story. So you see the Karate Kid story from his perspective. Then there's another trailer that sort of shows the same, like the Karate Kid story, but from the bad guy's perspective, the kid with blonde hair, who's his nemesis in the movie. You see the story from his perspective, and like Superman, there's all the different, like all sorts of movies have trailers that show different stories about what the film is about. So sometimes I might start the film or the class off with movie clips also that show opposing viewpoints. So I asked them to think like, what kind of story is this? Now write your letter in the style of that, either comparative story or chronological story. Like they're the bad guy, not us. There are different, you have to think about like what story is going to be effective for the facts that you're stuck with. And how can you use them to your advantage? So they rewrite the same letter from one perspective, then from the other. So now they've gotten a lot of different kind of modes of thinking, and it might be sort of a mishmash, but at least they've been thinking about how to be effective in communicating the facts. And then as a final point, I asked them to make it vivid. So if they haven't done so already, I want them to incorporate some kind of like imagery or like powerful words or something to catch and keep the attention of the reader and to highlight the facts that you want to highlight, or an aspect of your story that you want to upplay or downplay. So I asked them to read through one more time, make it vivid, use like catchy, sticky words that stay in your reader's mind. If repetition is important, start repeating words throughout the brief that are going to stick with the reader from the introduction to the facts, and then ultimately in the analysis, those words will be repeated as well. So it creates a theme just through word choice. And then again, I say, you know, like take this, you'll need to modify it a little bit, but this can be your statement of facts, or like a draft to get you started on the statement of facts. So that's what I've got. Those are 2 things that hopefully you can use. I tried to write it in such a way that it was more like, for whatever discipline you can assign the relevant text for you, small group here, large group here. But again, I'm happy to share this with anyone, or I'll share it with you and you can post it or something. But yeah, that's what I've got. So, I mean, I don't even know what time it is, but
2:40.
2:40. Okay. So
there wasn't there?
Yeah. I thought, yeah, I don't think there's a clock anywhere. But these are some of the things I've done, and they're very specific to, again, legal writing. But I would love to know if this resonates with anyone, or if there are any kind of like models that you use that you could share with me, or I don't know, with the others, that are related to this, or other in-class exercises, or how this might work in your classroom. So yeah, we could kind of open it up. Yeah.
I think I really appreciate about these examples is it gets into drafting as the process of writing, and having the students not only do that in class, but bounce things off each other, basically. So they've got models to work with, and they can talk to each other about what's working in those models, and they can actually start working on them in the moment there. And so I think it's a good way of taking the stigma off of writing, that it just, you know, writing isn't this thing that's just a scary blank screen, you know, by ourselves, but this is to talk about how it works, talk about what's working, have some models to play with, because that's another thing that both of these assignments, even though they're very specific to law in a lot of ways, but in a lot of other ways, I'm seeing applications, pretty wide. She can do variations on this for whatever kind of writing task you need, and it gives a lot of fun ways to play with that. So
Yeah.
and relatively contained too. So there's a lot you can do in the context, just depending, anywhere from 50-minute session all the way up to, if you're once a week for 3 hours, you can still do some interesting things.
Yeah. And I think taking the stigma out of writing and make it the scary thing is like a key part of this, because like I was saying earlier, they're afraid to sit down, and then it's like, is my writing going to be good? Forcing them to have to give snippets of their writing. And I'll take volunteers usually, but if nobody volunteers, then I'll just go to like, you haven't spoken yet, because can you share? So then they start to see the incentive to go first. When there's like a shorter piece, there's not as much attached to it. But I found that my students were very willing to share, because I think they wanted to hear the feedback from their peers. So the combination of like, it's not a lot of pressure. This is all early stage, so you don't have to, you came into this class with knowing nothing. I think that's like one of the more valuable pieces of it, so they don't feel like they're so alone and like in the process. So yeah, thanks.
How long are usually the classes that you teach?
So this class was like, I want to say it was like an hour and 15 minutes maybe. But the exercise doesn't need to go that long. Like I would say maybe to give them time and not rush anyone, maybe 45 minutes.
Okay.
If you could cut out a few steps, you could minimize how many people read back, and then it could be like a half an hour. But again, you could extend it. You could, based on what you want them to do, you could build in more things. You could have more robust discussions about the different examples that you're giving them. So yeah, I think you could stretch it into like an hour and a half class if you wanted to, but it could also be really short.
I was gonna ask the same thing, because one of the things I struggle with is finding the time to implement these things in class.
Yeah.
So, yeah, like we're week 2 and we're already behind, so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So like the introduction of a legal brief is usually like in a shorter brief, it's going to be maybe 3/4 of a page to a 1 page. So it's not a really extended piece of writing, but you have to do a lot in that 1 page of introduction. So it's almost harder to write it because you have to do some very specific things basically up front. If you lose your audience in the introduction, the judge is already going to be like, I'm not reading this, or the opposing counsel will, they won't have much to work with. It just won't serve its purpose. So I think, again, depending what you have in psychology, right? You could take something that's very short in order to, the facts section could be multiple pages long. So it's a different kind of story that you're telling there. But if something's like very specific, I think that's a good way to approach or to use this exercise for something that's shorter, because if it has like these 5 things that you need to accomplish, just structure the things they need to write around those 5 things.
And do you assign grades for this part of it?
No. Yeah. It's just like, it's mostly just to give them a draft to walk home with, is the purpose.
I appreciate everything that you've shown us. It's great. I was thinking about connecting to the dilemma, always the dilemma of time. And then one thing that's striking me is that you could easily do this as like a 10-minute warm up that you can tie to a theme, so that you're not getting behind in your content, but you're tying exercises to the content. Like you can imagine you're reading a couple of articles, then you could just take 10 minutes, talk about the abstract and how it was composed, and then have them like write down whatever their project is, write down, spend 10 minutes writing your version of abstract and submit it. So like just pulling out pieces of this and threading it into your course. Because what I really appreciated is the explicit attention to, these are genres. They're genres you're not supposed to know. That's why you're here. So we're not going to pretend like you're going to invent the genre on your own. We're going to be here and we're going to break it down for you. So I can see how that could work really well. And any kind of class is to break it down. A lot of people will balk at thinking they have to spend 30 minutes or 45, but if you think it's 10 minutes or 15 as an icebreaker activity,
Yep.
or we're gonna pay attention to genre or to this or that, because my students would struggle with like, now make it vivid. They would like need the entire, like, what do you mean make it vivid?
Yeah.
Right? So there's some leaps of faith in there too,
Yep.
that some students will get and others won't get.
Yep.
And so I would love to see it like sprinkled across my classes, just to
Yeah.
not be overwhelming.
Yeah, and I think like the point to make it vivid, that's why it's so important to have either started class with what are the persuasive writing techniques that you need to know, so that when you say make it vivid, they're like, oh, that means
Yeah.
sticky words or imagery or something like that. So, you know, stuff you've sort of already talked about. I think the writing exercises are more helpful if you've already kind of given them some background in what good writing, and what the writing must be and what it could be. So in a way, it could be the end of your class, or it could be like you talked about it in one class and then your next class starts off with the
And
exercise.
even just like talking about the different authors you're reading in the course of a semester, like, is this author someone who is persuasive, appealing? Why? What are they doing that makes it less so? Is this, again, I'm so sorry, I have an extra minute 3, I have to go to,
Yeah.
but thank you so much.
Thank you.
Just keep the conversation going for me.
Nice to see you.
I was gonna say, I'm blown away at how close to journalism this actually is.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very close.
Yeah. And I think I was inspired by the who, what, where, why, when of how targeted an introduction needs to be. It really is sometimes the only thing that someone will read in a brief, just to get a sense of like, what are they asking for? What's this case about? So I think about it as, I mean, again, I only took one class in journalism in high school, but I think about, what I remember is like that you need to capture them in the first paragraph or two and give all like the key information there. And then you can develop it later on, but you need to find a way to put that there in a catching way that also fits the mold of what legal writing looks like. So
I use a piece, by the way, from Texas Monthly about someone that was convicted of child abuse.
okay.
And really, it's ultimately a piece about the law where you have to register the registry and how unfair it can be and its impact, but it tells the story of this particular man in his case. And in the beginning, you learn that he's been convicted of child abuse. By the end, you're very sympathetic to him. So it is a really strong case for how persuasive facts can be for one thing, and also storytelling.
Yes. I mean, I just insist on the storytelling so much because ultimately it's about communication. And
That's legally
communication could be
Yeah.
could be good, it could be not so good. But if you can't communicate with your audience, then they're going to be so lost, and you don't want them digging for like, what are they saying here? What's the proof for this assertion? You want that to be like very clear, and you need to be very clear and straightforward in some places, but the introduction is the place where you can have more creative brain. So for students who are coming in thinking like, the students from the science backgrounds are like, great, we love the structure, we love the kind of like technical structure of this. And the students coming in as English majors or psychology majors or political science are like, we love the kind of the artistic license to use our own voice. And I do talk a lot about voice. So I'm like, this is Robert Mueller's voice. This is the New York attorney's voice. This is like other lawyers' voices that you're seeing here. You need, as part of this process, to be cultivating your own voice. And
that's how you beat AI.
Yeah, so it's as much of a growth exercise, I think, and it's empowering for them also, I think, to start to develop. I mean, it's empowering just to have written something from nothing in the course of a half an hour or 45 minutes or something. But I think it sort of also empowers them to think like, I can take this in so many different ways. I can be my own voice in this whole, process.
I like the way you're working through different genres, in different functions. Your point about focusing on the purpose and the audience of the writing is really great, because in my courses, I'll be dealing with stuff in the trade journals, and so we talk about what the trade journals are, what the punchy sort of purpose of this is, and learn to interpret that kind of style. But I'm teaching a class right now, which is a senior level film theory class. And so
Okay.
like, here's people writing 80, 90 years ago about this in this particular style. It's being translated from Russian or from German. Understand that context and that world, but then wanting them to put those ideas kind of in their own words. So they're making sure that they get it, but then they understand the rhetorical format of those pieces as we kind of go through there. So that they're not only learning how to read, but learning how to, think and write, where these people are coming from and how they're conceiving these ideas and these forms.
Yeah, and I honestly haven't had a lot of time to think about like, okay, how would like to even like an abstract, I should have like I could have like tried to redraft this for an abstract, but I think that is a great example of like a piece that you could work on, like using these techniques. But I was like, what if a physics professor comes? Like, how am I going to reach the physics department?
This is the sort of thing I wish, I was in grad school 30 years ago when I started grad school, but I wish we would have had something like this. More of a focus on writing. We typically, a lot of us in our PhD programs, we got that pushback, once we turned in our papers, then we got red marks all over and everything. But this sort of thing, I think is great, because you're seeing the model of the writing. We're going to work through what this looks like, how this feels and everything like this. We're going to kind of model that in a safe space, really, with each other, instead of worrying about, am I doing it right? Am I doing it right?
Yeah. And I think, again, like it's helpful to do it sort of towards the end of like a session of classes where you're talking about what an abstract needs to be. So they're not like trying to understand what an abstract is while they're trying to write one. So I think putting this, it could be used as a preparatory exercise just to get them thinking creatively. But if you want them to walk away with something that they can actually like take home and work from, I think it's helpful to put it at the end of that session. So they're like, they already know they've already learned most of the technical stuff they're supposed to know. They've read the briefs, they've looked at examples, and then now it's just a matter of like applying it. You might ask them to go home and do this, but only, like 2 of them will actually do it. So doing it in class at that point in the, in your course is I think more effective than the other way around. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, it's really nice to